Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weep Union, and in this one the Russians managed to make a small advance along the Dnipro river near Kherson. The Russians also managed to advance in the northern flank of Korokhove. The Ukrainians managed to make some counterattacks near Pokrovsk in the eastern and western flanks. The Russians made a small advance to the east of Pokrovsk, and the Russians managed to expand their bridgehead across the Oskil river line near Kupiansk and Devorishne. Starting out in the central section of the front line, the Russians have managed to close the pocket that was formed in the eastern parts of Andriivka, eliminating the Ukrainian forces in the area and moving further westwards along the main highway through Andriivka as they are fighting through the Ukrainian positions, trying to dislodge them from the town. The Russians are currently pushing the Ukrainians out from the town itself and up to the fortified positions, following which the Russians will likely look to push the Ukrainians out completely. This is likely inspired by the fact that over the past few weeks, the Russians have been fighting over Dashne, for example, where the Ukrainians have no escape route. This means that they'll be fighting until the end. This led to a very slow capture of Dashne by the Russian forces. Instead, the Ukrainians are now being pushed to the fortified positions and then along the first lines, which leaves them an escape route. This will limit the amount of casualties that the Ukrainians take, but will also significantly speed up the Russian capture of Andriivka, which is currently in full swing as the Russians are looking to gain full control over the town and are pushing the Ukrainians out to the outskirts of it. And with the main highway under their control, they are now bordering Constantinople both from the southern and northern flanks, which indicates an imminent attack on the town in the coming days. At the same time, the Ukrainian positions near Ulekli in the fortified positions and within the town itself are also in a very difficult position as the Russians have aligned the front line along the Vovchia River line to the north and the Sukhyeli River line to the south alongside the town. This means the only road in and out of the town is the one near Constantinople. An attack by the Russian forces on Constantinople from the northern and southern flanks will allow them to cut off the only highway connection, the only road, the only possible way for the Ukrainian forces to enter or exit Ulekli, and this will completely encircle the Ukrainian forces to the south of the Vovchia River line and north of the Sukhyeli River line. Any surviving Ukrainian forces west of Korokhove will then be eliminated through that encirclement, and the Russian forces will gain control over the fortified positions and the two towns, and this will allow the Russians to start an assault towards Rusliv and Bahatir, allowing the front line between Korokhove and Vasilika and Vasilka, allowing the Russian forces to have several connections between the two for further operations in a western direction towards the Dnipropetrovsk region. Talking about the Dnipropetrovsk region, it is interesting to see whether the Russians even have an interest in entering it or not, considering the fact that they have not annexed the region. And this is up for question because Trump and Putin had a phone call. In this phone call, they talked about the war in Ukraine. Trump claims that 2 million people have died in the war, but doesn't elaborate on who has died. But what is very interesting is that Putin and Trump have not talked about this phone call besides what Trump has just said. And what he says about this phone call is that practically Putin also wants the war to end and he wants people to stop dying. And if you asked anyone in a diplomatic setting, everyone would agree to that they want people to stop dying and a war to end. He does not elaborate further on how the war should end or anything else, and this shows that there's absolutely no progress towards a peace deal despite a phone call between Trump and Putin. And this indicates that Russia is unlikely to negotiate a peace deal until they achieve their goals. And what Trump is saying is that practically it is very difficult for him to negotiate a peace deal. So he's just trying to play the media in a positive sense, where he's saying, well, he wants the war to end as well, so we have something to grab onto for negotiations, to justify the negotiations, but it doesn't seem that there's any progress whatsoever yet. Returning to the frontline situation, in the direction of Kherson, the Russians managed to make a small advance in the islands in between the Russian and Ukrainian positions, and this is a position where there is Antonovsky Bridge to the west, And then alongside this road, there is a bridge across a rail bridge that goes through Dnipro. So this could be a direction where the Russian forces could cross over in combination with the Andriivka bridge. Naturally, the majority of the bridge is damaged, the same with the railway bridge, and they are unusable. However, being able to cross some of the distance and then potentially fixing it in the long run, or creating pontoon bridges underneath it to have the bridge as a cover, as we saw with the Andriivka bridge, those are also possibilities for crossings across the Dnipro river line, or if they want to cross over with boats or whatever they want to cross over with in the long term, as Russians will eventually have to cross over if they want to gain full control over the region, and therefore these fights are in preparation for that. Currently, we see no indication that any operation is planned in this direction, as they would need a large gathering of forces and an element of surprise. So if there is no indication that such an offensive is coming, it will not say whether there is or isn't one coming, because the point would be that there would be no indication. However, so far there doesn't seem to be a single offensive. There was no indication of it happening before it happened, except for potentially the Kursk incursion. I was not aware that it would happen before it happened. The possibility was there, but the days leading up to, there was no indication that it was going to happen. And from the Ukrainian soldiers that participated, they said that they were rotated from the Kharkiv section of the front line to the Sumy region within a couple of days before, and they were told that they had no access to their phones or communication outside their unit and all of these stuff ahead of the operation, and they weren't told that they were entering into the Kursk region before they were actually going to do so. So it was very secretive, and they didn't even tell the United States or the West about it. They asked for permission to strike into Russian territory, which indicated something was coming in that direction. And we all knew it was possible that the Ukrainians could attack Russian territory. But for that specific operations happening at a specific time at a specific place was not apparent before it happened. While operations such as the Ukrainian Summer Offensive 2023, the Ukrainian Kharkiv Offensive, the Russian offensive operations were all apparent before they happened. Moving on along the northern flank of Kharkov, the Russians have managed to capture the remaining parts of Sribne and moved into Zaporizhia. At the same time, they captured the forest lines to the north of Sribne, securing their positions within the town. The Russians will continue alongside the forest lines to the south, alongside the town into Zaporizhia and into Preobrazhenka, and along the forest patches to the north, south of Andriivka, as the Russians continued offensive operations towards the Dnipropetrovsk region. The Russians were pushed back along Kotlina. The Ukrainians launched an attack, recapturing some fortified positions and pushing the Russians back, where the Russians are now attacking the flanks of the Ukrainians to try and dislodge them from their positions, and the Ukrainians are attempting to do the same in the direction of Kotlina, where they're attacking from the northern and southern flanks. The objective of the Ukrainians is to cut off the Russian positions from the remaining parts of the front line and encircle their forces near Kotlina to then dislodge the Russian forces from the railways here to the west of Pokrovsk and then back towards the towns of Vovkova and the fortified positions to the south. The Russians are attempting to negate that and gain their upper hand by pushing the Ukrainians away from the fortified positions they recently captured and Kotlina itself, securing the eastern flank as they push further into Udashna in the west. Once the Russians capture Udashna and the coal mine to the northwest of Kotlina, they will have a secure enough position to focus their forces in the direction of Pokrovsk, and the Ukrainians would be unable to repeat such an operation. This is why this operation is very decisive, because if this fails, then the Russians are likely to gain the upper hand here to the west of the Pokrovsk direction, and they'll be able to secure the positions here. If the Ukrainians succeed, they'll be able to significantly slow down the Russian offensive operations in the area, similar to the Ukrainian counterattack within Chasiv Yar, where they managed to regain control over the fire plant, which allowed the Ukrainians to significantly slow down the Russian capture of the city. The Russians attacked Yelisavetivka from the southern flank, gaining control over the forest patch and forest lines to the southwest of it, and they were kicked out of the eastern parts of it as well as the forest lines near it. From this, we see that there's a back and forth near Yelisavetivka where the Russians are trying to gain control of it, but the Ukrainians are exerting heavy resistance. Despite the initial footage we saw of the Russians entering Yelisavetivka in a tank battle head-on, where a Russian tank destroyed 2 Ukrainian tanks, the Ukrainians kept sending new reinforcements in to regain control of it, as it is the last town ahead of the highway, and this is the main reason the Russians have been unable to completely secure the highway and move beyond it, and that is that the Ukrainians still have the positions along the fortified positions here to the east of Pokrovsk and near Andriivka. The Russians gain control of it will allow them to redirect their forces to the northern flank, gain control of the river line and the road, supplying the Ukrainian forces along the pocket here in between the area between Vosishenka and Toretsk, and also allow the Russians to then move in the direction of Pokrovsk itself along the highway and beyond it in the northern direction, where they were able to flank a lot of the fortified positions of the Ukrainians in the area. Moving on to the Oskil river line direction, the Russians have managed to expand the zone of control west of Zapetne, gaining control over several forest lines and a large portion of the highway from the Vorishne towards Kupiansk. The Russians have now captured about half of the distance between the Vorishne and Kupiansk as they move in the direction of the western bank of the town. And we see that the Russian forces are concentrating in between the areas from the western and eastern bank of the river line in the direction of Kupiansk. The objective is gaining full control over the town and completely encircling the Ukrainian forces on the eastern bank within the pocket formed there. And we've seen no additional Ukrainian advances near Sahrisove since the recapture of the town. And this indicates that there is a stalemate in the direction so far. And this will allow the Russians to hold on to their positions as long as the Ukrainians do not make additional gains in the area. We see that the area that the Ukrainians need to gain is about half of the distance the Russians need to gain on the western bank. And we see based on this that the Russians are currently in a position in a race against time with the Ukrainian forces, where the Russian capture of Kupiansk, surpassing the speed of the Ukrainian securing of the road here to the east of the river line, will allow the Russians to completely encircle the Ukrainian forces. If the Ukrainians manage to outspeed the Russians, then they'll be able to clear up the dangers of that, and they'll be able to secure the town as well, as they'll be able to draw out some of their forces. We are likely to see the Ukrainians attempt some sort of counterattack to dislodge the Russian forces from the western bank of the Oskil river line. Otherwise, the situation will grow out of control for the Ukrainian forces, and the Russians will escalate the situation alongside the western bank of the river line. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out our Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.